To start with, I've been getting messages through mediums for several years that I'm supposed to write my own story. And I've just resisted that because I think, who wants to hear that? It's not that interesting. It has some interesting elements, but I don't know if I could write a whole book. But a long time ago, when I first thought about writing a memoir, I had the idea of calling it Growing from the Ashes because of experience that I've had. And I'm a Scorpio, and it said that Scorpio must burn the worst of themselves and rise from the ashes like the phoenix. It's kind of ironic for me because I have had all my life a tremendous fear of fire. And in fact, I lived in a house with a fireplace for 3 years and never used it once. And yet I've had many different fire experiences, I found out. Anyway, but that's beside the point. I decided to title my story Growing from the Ashes. And I'm going to share my screen. I have a little PowerPoint. And hopefully you are all seeing now a picture of a phoenix. Nod if you're okay. So that's why I chose this picture. So because in a sense, out of destruction and chaos came my spiritual growth. When I was a child, my mother's mother, my grandmother, was apparently interested in spiritualism, and so was her husband, my grandfather's brother, Reginald. And I grew up hearing stories of when my grandmother was ill, her seeing this beautiful white hand floating around her bed. And then later, when she moved to a particular house and the vicar came over, excuse me, she told him about an old lady that she had seen walking around the house. And when she described this old lady, the vicar says, "Oh yes, that's Mrs. Green, who lived here and died here." Well, this didn't trouble my grandmother at all. I was fine with her. But my mother was terrified of anything to do with spirit, as her terror was like my fear of fire. She just, couldn't deal with it. And I'm told that when she was 4 years old and the spiritualist came over to visit my grandmother, that she ran under the table and hid there and wouldn't come out until they had gone. This was in England, where I was born. Later, when my mother was in boarding school, she told me that she and her friends were playing. This was a warning to me. She and her friends were playing with a Ouija board, and they were making fun. And all of a sudden, the planchette flew out of her hand and across the room. And then this big dress, like an armoire, moved into the room. So she always had these stories to scare me with. Well, my mother grew up in the Church of England, and she married a Jewish man, my father. And when I was 7, Jehovah's Witnesses came to our house, and she said to them, "If you can persuade my husband that Jesus was the Savior and the Son of God, I'll study with you." And so she studied with them, and my father was tolerant, and he listened, and he went to the meetings and studied that religion for a couple of years. And then that was enough for him. But that's how I was raised. And if anyone knows about that cult, which is how I view it now, you know that they believe that any spirit contact is demonic. We were taught not to meditate, because if you emptied your mind, Satan would come rushing in to fill it with whatever. I don't know what they thought that Satan was going to put in your mind, but that was the thing. We were always to be on guard. So we'd have these little experiences. One time when I was about 16, I was asleep, and my mother came in to wake me up. My brother, who was must have been about 10 at the time, had woken up and said that there was this big dark shape sitting by the bed. Now, he wasn't afraid of that, and he had other things like that happen that didn't scare him. But our mother completely freaked out. And she came into my room demanding to know what I had brought into the house that might have a demon attached to it. Well, funnily enough, the day before, I'd gone to the public library and borrowed a book called The Hand of Mary Constable by Paul Gallico, which is about a scientist who's been trying to communicate with his dead daughter. Well, that you can imagine that book got tossed out the back door faster than you can blink, and I was told in no uncertain terms to return it to the library the next day. So you see, I was already interested in the spirit world, but I was frightened of it too. This is my grandmother when she was young. And I don't know at what point she became interested in spiritualism, but she looks kind of spiritual there. I like that picture. And then my grandfather's brother, Reg, here, who was a spiritualist and had a reputation for being a bit odd. And I've never been able to find out exactly what that meant. And I don't think it was because he's wearing a suit on the beach in the summer, because my great-grandfather was doing that too. But they lived on the Isle of Wight, and I have actually been trying to find out, getting in touch with some of the spiritualist churches there to see if they have the old rolls and see if Uncle Reg was listed in them. There were other instances of experiences that left me afraid, that now when I look at them, I think, I can find an explanation for them. Like when I was 20 and newly married, my husband was working graveyard shift, funnily enough. And one night I had this dream, and I was absolutely terrified because I couldn't move, and I believed I was being controlled by a demon. And I guess it was some form of sleep paralysis, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night because I was so terrified. My husband was a minister, but he wasn't a very nice person. And yeah, more about that later. So going to sleep was always a challenge. One other thing about my mother, this was after I was married, and she was living in a house with a housemate, Nikki, and in her room there were 2 twin beds, and on one of them were, for some reason, several planks of wood. And so one night she woke up and she said there was a rapping on the wood. Somebody was knocking on the wood. And she called Nikki in, and supposedly when Nikki entered the room, her eyes started pouring with tears for no particular reason. And of course, they immediately started looking around for what might have come in the house with a demon. Well, long story short, they narrowed it down to a Catholic Bible. Now, remember, they're Jehovah's Witnesses, so Catholics and Catholicism was anathema to them. But this Catholic Bible that had come, I guess my husband had given it to them, and it came from a secondhand store. And they looked through it, and in the margins, on passages about the evils of divination, they found little handwritten notes saying that divination was a good thing. So the next day they threw it outside, and the next day they got a minister to come over to burn it, and it wouldn't burn, supposedly. So these are the kinds of things that I grew up on. And I was always curious, but it wasn't until after I got kicked out of that religion for the second time on my 35th birthday, that's November 9th, 1985. I like to think of that as the day that my guides finally hit me over the head with a 2x4 and rescued me. The elders said that I was a danger to the congregation, which I now wear as a badge of honor. So that was half a lifetime ago. And I had my very first psychic reading shortly thereafter with a woman named Sandra. A friend of mine introduced me to her. And she said something very strange that's always stuck with me about my daughter. My daughter, who was about I think she was 12 or 13 at the time, and she'd always had severe behavioral problems, very difficult child. She'd had a closed head injury when she was very young. And this woman, Sandra, said, "Your daughter is like a wounded deer in the forest. You either have to save her or shoot her," which was obviously a very shocking thing to say. And sadly, I was unable to save her. And 14 years later, her boyfriend shot her to death. And some of you know this story. And this is not the man who shot her, by the way. So after her death is where my spiritual journey really began. I mean, it's funny because she and I butted heads all the time. And there were only three areas of life that we could talk about without going at it with each other. And one was cats. We both loved cats. And one was cooking. And the other was cards. I think of the three C's. We had an interest in tarot cards, and we shared like probably 20 decks between us. And we could talk about that. And shortly before she was killed, like just a few weeks, she wanted me to see that movie. Oh shoot, I can't think. You know, the M. Night Shyamalan's first movie, The Sixth Sense. And she drove up with her boyfriend 100 miles from Orange County, California, and we went to the movies to see that one. And she kept looking at me, I noticed. She kept looking at me to see how I was reacting to this movie, because obviously I had raised them with this fear of spirit too, up until that point, until the point that I got kicked out, excommunicated. So she was killed. Her boyfriend killed himself too. And I wanted to know what happened next, because I no longer believed what I'd been taught, which was that we all rest in the graves until after God's war, Armageddon, where most of the population would die, and then all of the people who had died before Armageddon would be resurrected and have a chance to live forever. Well, I didn't believe that anymore. So I had gone to see Brian Hurst, who some of you may know. He's an English medium who lived in my area in Los Angeles. And so I had seen him and didn't have a successful reading. He had to stop it because it wasn't working. And then I had another group session with him where he said some amazing things. So after Jennifer's death, I contacted him and asked if I could come and see him. And that was a really astounding reading. And a few weeks after that, I went to a big group of John Edward. It was before his TV show, and he was in Los Angeles, and I showed up at the last minute and was picked out of about 1,000 people. It was kind of funny because he was explaining, he came running in late because he'd flown in and they'd lost his baggage, and he was a little flustered, and he said, "Well, I'm going to explain my process to you, and a little while later, you know, some of your people will probably come through." And he said, "Oh, wait a minute. Somebody's coming right to the front of the line and insisting on being heard now." And he said, "There's gunshots. It's a murder." And I, you know, of course, my ears perked up. And I looked around, and a woman a few rows behind me got up and she said, "It's my son." And he said, "No, it's a daughter." And then he went on to give a lot of evidence, and including some things that I didn't know until the next week. A year later, just the day before my birthday, James Van Prague came to my house and taped a show. And all the circumstances were, I believe that Jennifer had a hand in that. And I had, you know, some really wonderful experiences that way. And of course, what I learned was what you already know, all of you, that there is no death, but there is a lot of life after Earth. Well, when my daughter's life on Earth ended, I always thought I would write a book about it. And that was when I started thinking about titling the book Growing from the Ashes. But it was just too difficult to do. I'd already written 2 nonfiction books, were published. But, you know, writing your own story, it's really quite different. I'd written about handwriting psychology because I'm a forensic document examiner and handwriting analyst. But this was very different. And then later, I started writing fiction about a forensic handwriting analyst. But I really wanted to write something where I could share with other people what I had learned from the spirit world. And I think it was in 2017 or 2018 that I learned about AREI. And I wish I could remember where I learned about it from, but I went to Scottsdale to the symposium there, and I met some really wonderful people, some of whom are here, and made some very good friends. And then went back in 2018. And then that event, I guess it was 2017, I think, but that really opened my eyes even further. And I met Sonia Rinaldi, and she allowed me to join her group of 30 moms. And some of you have seen these pictures that she got of Jennifer. And you can see, if this was Jennifer when she left the earth, and this is 20 years later. But if you look at the eyebrows and the eyes, the mouth, you can see it's not the same picture, but it's clearly the same person. So after attending that second symposium, I started thinking about how I could write about spirit, if not from my own experience, from a fictional point of view. So, you know, I had published, I don't know how many by then, 5, 6, or there are 8 in the series now, of the forensic series, but I'd had several by then. And it was gaining a following. So, you know, who says that spirit works in mysterious ways? We do. And I'm kind of a psychic junkie, like some of you. And during that time, over a period of months, I had 3 readings with different psychics. Some were mediums, but they all told me the same thing, that I would be writing a book with my daughter. And so I started thinking about that, what I could write. And it suddenly came to me, I got, you know, sort of a psychic intuition, a little flash, that the story, which would become titled Proof of Life, would be about a young woman I had written about 5 years earlier. I wrote a book called What She Saw. It was a standalone. It wasn't part of my series, although my series characters are in it. And it's about a young woman who wakes up on a train and she has complete amnesia. She doesn't know who she is, where she's come from, where she's going. So I thought, I'm going to pick up her story 5 years later. And she's been hearing voices from spirit all this time, but she doesn't want the connection. She's resisting it, ignoring it. But a friend of hers in the FBI comes to her knowing that she has these experiences and taps her to help him find a missing child. And that was why Proof of Life, because, you know, when someone's kidnapped, they might hold a newspaper up in front of them as proof of life. You see the date. And of course, our meaning of proof of life. And then I realized that one of my other books, one of the forensic books called Written Off, had a young man in it that needed to be her love interest. And so I wrote Proof of Life. And I would I would love to say that Jennifer took over my hands and did all the typing and came up with a story, but it wasn't that easy. But there were some times when I strongly felt her presence, and I would ask questions. There's something about the plot that I knew needed to be resolved, and I just, you know, I couldn't figure out what needed to happen. I would say, Jennifer, what do I need to do? And almost immediately, it would be like getting a download. And in fact, the man I had been seeing at that time died suddenly at the end of 2016. And he showed up and wanted to be in the book and gave me some important information for the book. So that was very cool. And at the back, I added a little bit about my personal story. I've just told you some of it, and also some resources. And Wendy had been kind enough to read the book and helped me on a scene with a seance, and helped stop me from making some bad mistakes. And so I added resources that people could use who were grieving. And I had readers thank me, and I'm going to show you a couple of their comments in a moment. But, you know, since Spirit basically had encouraged me to write that book, I expected it to sell 1 million right away. Well, maybe not 1 million, but more than it did. I really liked the characters, and I started thinking about the next book, the next plot. And then I had a reading, a really stunning reading with Joe Higgins, who many of you know. And something he said in our conversation sparked an idea for the next book that I couldn't wait to write. That's the one I've just finished writing and is going to be released on October 1st. Actually, Amazon has already released the print book, but the ebook will be on October 1st. I really was anxious to write it, but my publisher at the time wanted me to write another Claudia Rose book. And so I took Claudia to Egypt and Gibraltar and England. And then I went back to the new series, which I've called Beyond the Veil, Supernatural Suspense or Paranormal Suspense. So the log line for the new book, The Last Door, is this. When two sisters inherit a Victorian mansion from a stranger, the bequest changes everything they knew about their past. And it's a ghost story, basically. So here's one of the comments that I got, not from that book, but from Proof of Life on Amazon. I've been curious, but also afraid of the other side. Didn't want to stop reading. Resources definitely appreciated. So that is a really important comment for me, because it showed me that I had reached at least one person, which is my goal. And, you know, my calling may not be mediumship as I once thought it might be, but hopefully I can do my part through the fictional world that I've created. And this was, I think this one just came up yesterday. Having lost a son, this book resonated with me, blah, blah, blah. And now I want to know more about mediums and the afterlife. So that was very gratifying. And here are the 3 books. I've had readers send me their own personal experiences, which is just great. And, you know, as Wendy mentioned, through my attendance at the AREI symposiums, I have the privilege of hosting a bi-monthly Zoom session on, well, our original focus was on automatic writing because, you know, I'm a handwriting analyst. That was what I was interested in. And a lot of other people are interested in that too. But in the last almost 4 years, we've expanded our reach and we talk about all sorts of spiritual topics. So you're all welcome to come. We meet on the 1st and 3rd Wednesdays at 5:30 Pacific time. Finally, I want to say, I don't know if any of you have watched the Netflix show Lucifer, but I discovered it a couple of months ago, and since then have binge watched all 6 seasons. And it's kind of like, it occurred to me, it's like what I'm trying to do with my fiction, the paranormal fiction. It gives people who wouldn't otherwise think about heaven and hell and the afterlife and all those sorts of things, it gets them to think about it. And if you haven't seen it, it's that Lucifer has been in hell where he was cast by his father and forced to torture people for eons, millennia. And he gets tired of doing that. So he comes to Los Angeles for a vacation because we're better, and stays here. He likes it here. But it's a story about family relationships. He's very angry with his father for throwing him out, as he says. And over the 6 seasons, you see his growth and how he doesn't have to stay the person that he was, and he can grow into something far better. And it even made me think a lot about, I mean, their view in the show, their view of hell is pretty much what we say, in that, it's not a place where you go and burn for all eternity. It's each person makes their own hell out of their guilt. And if they can work through it, they can go on to another level. So it's kind of a non-threatening way to look at heaven and hell and the afterlife.